Welcome to the Dukes, Lancaster's premier art cinema. We're here to talk about David Lynch. I'm Professor Catherine Spooner. I'm Professor of Literature and Culture at Lancaster University.
I'm Dr. Kwasu David Tembo. I'm a full-time lecturer in the el&cw department. I teach world literature, film, media, music and literature, and soon-to-be science fiction as well. And it's really great to be here. I'm so glad we got an opportunity to just talk. We both have glancing each other sort of in corridors, it's very clear we have a deep sensibility that's shared when it comes to cinema in general, but I think we've in certain respects bonded over our shared appreciation of Lynch.
I think we both felt quite deeply affected when he recently passed away, and felt that this was something that would be very meaningful for us to do.
I agree. So thank you to the Dukes for having us, and thanks to Jonathan Allot for putting this together. And I think maybe just by way of starting things off, I might just ask you about when you first encountered Lynch.
It was quite late actually, or late in his career, not late for me. So I first encountered David Lynch when Twin Peaks was aired in the UK. And I was in sixth form at the time. I must have been about 16 or 17.
Right.
Perfect age to encounter Twin Peaks. I remember reading about it in the newspaper before it was aired and just thinking this sounded like the most enticing television show I'd ever heard of. And then immediately just becoming enraptured by it. And it was, water cooler TV in the days before that was really invented.
Yeah.
I would talk about it with my friends the next day at school. If I was out in the evening, I would hurry home so that I could watch it in that way that we don't really have now because everything's on streaming services.
That's right.
So it really felt like a TV event. It was so exciting. And I very quickly went on after that to watch as many of David Lynch's films as I could find, really throughout the 1990s.
Interesting.
How about you? How did you first encounter
Lynch? I think it's quite similar in a sense that I came to Lynch quite late. I think I was in Edinburgh. It might have been 2014. I had spent a lot of time at this flat of my friend Scott's on Nicholson Street in Edinburgh, and we just watch a lot of films. We'd often watch a lot of Spielberg films. He loved Spielberg and so on. But him and the person he was seeing at the time would keep talking about Twin Peaks, and it was just one of those, a director in a text or a series so embedded in the sort of zeitgeist across time, across decades, across cultures even. The Lynchian in and of itself has this sort of idiosyncratic gravity about it that draws what I like to think of as a very Yiddish sensibility out of the viewer. Lots of strange ambiguities, but it's absolutely arresting and so unique. And they spoke about it so highly, and I was like, yeah, I've heard of this and so on. I know it's one of those things as a cinephile that I'm supposed to encounter and supposed to have an experience or reading thereof. And then they played the pilot of the first season of Twin Peaks, and it was just...
So Twin Peaks was your first experience
it
too.
Was.
It's interesting, that's the gateway drug for a lot of people.
Yeah, which is interesting when you think about his oeuvre entirely. So I know we're going to be talking about Eraserhead and Mulholland Drive, and I might just actually linger on Twin Peaks a little bit. Do you have a favorite character? Is there an aspect of...
Audrey, of course.
Okay.
I mean, especially, watching it as a 16, 17-year-old girl, Audrey was the heroine. She was, just her rebelliousness, that scene in the pilot episode where she changes her shoes at school and she's wearing the black and white saddle shoes and she changes to the red kitten heels. And that just was everything. That was everything, that scene. So Audrey, of course. How about you?
I quite like, there's so many, there's such an ensemble cast. There's so many characters. There's such a well-populated milieu. It's more than just a sort of like a tableau or backdrop. It feels really embodied and idiosyncratic in a sort of like a very realistic way. They're all such weird individual characters, and strange things happen to them. And the strangeness of the events that you witness, strangely, is like a guarantor of their feeling of reality and immersion. So there's so many characters who go on great arcs that I didn't even expect to sort of like Bobby, for example. I kind of just like his development moments thereof. Just kind of catch me off guard. And that happens a lot with Lynch. There's so much of it that's sort of unpredictable in a way that I find very comforting, strangely.
I've been really surprised by how many of our current students really enjoy Twin Peaks, actually, and want to talk about it. And one of the characters that seems to really stand out for them is David Duchovny's character, Denise Bryson.
Right.
Because this is a version of a trans character on screen at a time when that really wasn't a very prevalent thing at all, where this was really quite innovative and unusual. And although there are constraints from the time that this show was made, nevertheless, in retrospect, this seems a largely very positive presentation, that the other characters just accept Denise Bryson's trans identity and don't question it. And this is something that seems to speak to our current students in particular.
I mean, that's amazing. And yeah, I mean, very encouraging in very many ways. And one thing that it sort of points to is, I think a lot of people, because Lynch is so associated with some sort of, even at its most reductive, a kind of absurd, a kind of Kafkaesque surreality, magical realism, and so on and so forth, I think, should you limit your estimation of Lynch and his over to that, you miss out on these very innovative, culturally resonant things that he does beyond just being quote unquote weird.
Yeah. So just to go back to your own first viewing of your first experience of Lynch, did you find that watching it was a transformational experience? Did that change the way you approached film or the way you thought about things, or did it change your research direction at all? How was that for you?
I think it was deeply resonant in a way. I keep thinking I keep thinking, and I might say, if this for a discussion about Eraserhead in terms of the sound design, Splat's sound design, him and Lynch spent an entire year just working on the actual sound, the textures of the film. And Lynch being known for these weird drones and chirps and his interest in machines and electricity, this kind of hum and so on. This weird intoning of something ineffable. He's able to do it quite directly, and I think that was revolutionary to me, certainly. I think the only other director I can think of maybe 3 directors who in my mind and in my sort of viewership occupy similar spaces, but Lynch is unique of that trio. It would be David Lynch, it would be David Cronenberg, and it would be Ken Russell. Yes. And I think they're all sort of quote unquote strange and weird. There's a kind of cerebral quality to Cronenberg. He's like, I mean, Naked Lunch and Scanners and all sorts. I mean, Altered States for Russell. They all strange and so on. But Lynch, there's something quite. I think that's what perplexes people about his elision of the ostensibly mundane and the really, really odd. It often in the dialogue, people are just sort of straight shooters, almost quintessentialized in this 50s dialect, but ensconced in these crazy scenarios. And there's something quite direct about both of those things. And I think when people encounter it for the first time, they're like, oh, that feels so familiar and so comforting and maybe a bit relieving, but it's still a surprise. It's a really uncanny experience.
I really feel that throughout the 90s, it was a kind of a way of finding your tribe. There were the people that liked Lynch and the people that didn't get it.
Sure.
If you were one of the ones that got it, then you could find the people that you knew you were going to get on with.
Yeah.
And I found it transformational, really, to my research. I was already very interested in Gothic literature and film. This is my area of research. But Lynch had a particular quality that I don't know, it's very hard to quantify, I think, but that I really, really responded to. So I often write about clothes in my research and fashion, style, dress, in costume, and it's all of the different aspects. And Lynch is really interested in surfaces and what people wear and fabrics and materials and kind of veils are so crucial to his work.
Curtains.
So we're sitting in front of a red curtain. Yeah. You'll notice that in virtually every film by Lynch, not every single one, but the overwhelming majority of films by Lynch, a curtain appears, usually a red curtain. Yeah. And they seem to have a particular significance to him, and that idea of what lies behind the veil.
Right.
And perhaps also perhaps nothing lies beyond the veil, and the quality of the veil itself, the surface of the fabric itself, the surface of the veil, as itself a kind of bearer of mystery, is so important. And that really had an influence on the direction of my research. I ended up writing about the Elephant Man in my PhD, which became eventually my first book, which is also, it's a book full of curtains. There are lots of curtains, lots of veils, lots of masks in all sorts of different ways. And that just felt really seminal for me. And although I didn't then write about Lynch again for some time, until I eventually ended up editing co-editing a collection of essays on Twin Peaks, it felt that he was behind a lot of the things I researched, even if I wasn't directly looking at him.
I understand,
he was informing the way I was looking.
Yeah, at its surfaces and materiality.
Absolutely.
Certainly. I think that's so interesting, and such an interesting echo in your current and future, directed work. And I mean,
absolutely,
it's interesting to, because often the red curtains are sort of an invitation and a barrier in equal measure. It's either you're looking at it or sort of transgressing through it. And by the time we get to the return, the dispersal of that kind of experience or point of view is so vast, both consciously and unconsciously, I guess. I mean, how did you find, having watched all of Twin Peaks, first, second, and return, what's your feeling of it as an entire, how would you compare your feelings towards it from your first experience of the pilot to now having watched it all?
Well, I'm currently in the process of rewatching it with my teenage children, who are absolutely loving it. And I am loving seeing how it still seems just as fresh, just as resonant at this moment to this generation as it did to me at the same age. And I think we do kind of maybe retrospectively revise our views of the first two seasons, now having seen the return. It kind of gives a different edge to it, perhaps. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that he did. This is one of the things that, this is one of the things that I find extremely important about Lynch, beyond this kind of just estimation of a sort of like weird wizard. I think the return shows that he still had a lot to say. And I think it shows that he had a lot to still show and explore insofar as these, transcendental meditation inflected Philadelphia versus Pacific Northwest, dichotomies and so on. He still had a lot to explore in all of these regions of his own life, his own experience and so on, and his own career, which I mean at that point was firmly established.
So his work still seems so incredibly resonant today, I think, and I think this was shown after his death. People were so upset by it in the way I can't imagine would happen for many film directors.
I agree.
At the present moment. I certainly felt very moved by
As
it.
did I.
Why do you think his work still retains that resonance?
I think it's because, and I like to think of it as a sort of Mr. Rogers problem, in the sense that people see this person who ostensibly is so this thing that they are, that they can't take it at face value, that there has to be some kind of guile or irony underpinning the ostensible illusion of two things that just can't cohere in our maybe perhaps cynical, maybe, I don't know, postmodern, epoch, Anthropocene, what have you. But Lynch kind of just always did that. It's so interesting to listen to critics and commentators, filmmakers and writers alike. David Foster Wallace being a very prominent, well-known voice in terms of support of Lynch, and his discussion of the difference between somebody like Tarantino and David Lynch, with the metaphor of the ear, being that Tarantino is interested in showing you a man's ear getting cut off, whereas David Lynch is interested in showing you the ear. So
lovely. That is such a great.
I think it's such a pithy summary of what made what describes Lynch's perspective. I mean, in Blue Velvet and so on, with the ear and the garden, the picket fence, the animatronic Robin.
I'm so glad you came back to that, because I was thinking very much about Blue Velvet when I was thinking about why Lynch is still resonant. I mean, I think people remember that shot, don't they, where the camera goes down into the grass and you see this network of
yeah,
weirdness and horror that's lying beneath the grass. And there's this sense of the darkness that's underlying everything. And I think a lot of people think that that's what Lynch is, the darkness that's underlying everything.
Yeah.
But I think what's so incredible about his work is that there's also a sense of the joy and the light that's underlying everything too. In those two things go together, they balance each other out.
Exactly.
And for me, that is what's so gorgeous about his work and why, you know, it keeps on speaking to us.
I couldn't have put it any better. And I think for a lot of people who are distrustful of Lynch and kind of, you know, brush off the very ardent appreciation of his work by a lot of people, to be fair, but, you know, are comfortable with perhaps marginalizing it or reducing it to this just nebulous weird, and not really understanding full well what an impact it is to have your name be associated with such an idiosyncratic form of the weird. The Lynchian in and of its, what greater legacy or what greater testament to your impact. But I mean, it's so interesting. So I mentioned...
Not many directors' names become an adjective,
This
right?
is true.
There are a few, there's a handful, but Lynch is one of them. The Lynchian, we know what that means.
Correct.
It's so distinctive as a style.
Correct.
And I guess that's another reason why his work is still so resonant, because of that visual distinctiveness.
That's true.
You know what the Lynchian is. It can be parodied as well.
This is true, yeah.
We all know red curtains and zigzag floors and donuts and coffee.
This is true. Backwards dialogue and so on.
Absolutely.
But it's almost a metric or a reference against which other texts can be measured. You know, that, it felt Lynchian. You know what that means, what it's gesturing to. But it's referring to Lynch and him himself. And I think that's what I meant by the sort of Mr. Rogers problem, is that people can't really accept that those two things cohere, that he is very sincere. I mean, Guillermo del Toro was asked recently, I think he was at a BFI talk about Lynch. And he said that he was friends with Mark Frost, and they went to lunch one day together after Frost's invitation. And he said the thing that struck him hardest and most immediately was the fact that Lynch is completely unironic, that there is no guile or pretense. And there's this, I think there's a clip of Tarantino talking about Inland Empire after having seen Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, which he loved. And he thought that Blue Velvet, like many, was a masterpiece. But he said that by the time he got to Inland Empire, he described it as really pretentious and so on, which I think he misses it, personally. I think Del Toro absolutely gets it, that he is completely unironic. You know, this sort of iddish combination of the very sincere, the sweet, the tender, the hopeful, maybe the naive, the jejune in some way, coheres with the most decaying, decrepit, intense, grotesquely material stuff.
And that's there right from the beginning, isn't it? So let's get on to Eraserhead.
For sure.
I'm thinking, if we're thinking about that contrast between the transcendent, the beautiful, the joyous, and the utterly grotesque, we have the baby, the creature, versus the woman behind the radiator. And they represent, right from the outset, those two sides of kind of Lynch's cinematic personality.
That's true. And she's got some interesting prosthetics on her face.
So I rewatched Eraserhead very recently, and for both me and my children, that reminded us of George Méliès's Voyage to the Moon.
The Moon, exactly. Same here.
So I'm sure this is deliberate. Of course, Lynch knows what he's doing. And that is absolutely fascinating to me, that he should be kind of aligning himself with that tradition of kind of fantastic cinema right from the outset, rather than the realist cinema strand that might be represented by the Lumiere brothers.
Exactly.
There's such a kind of self-consciousness and self-awareness, but kind of smartness about cinema history, even in a film that just seems so outlandish and unique and strange.
Even something as like Wild at Heart, with all the very obvious gestures and homages to The Wizard of Oz.
Of course.
So I think I also feel it's kind of appropriate, just looking way forward, of Spielberg reaching out to Lynch to play John Ford in The Fabelmans. I think it's like a 2-minute cameo. But I think Lynch is on his own accord, but I think even just his study of the form, he's so entrenched in the art life, so to speak. And I think cinema, as well as music, as well as painting, as well as furniture making, and a variety of other sort of artistic expressions. I think he was just sort of a he had a lot of depth as an artist, I think. And depth is really interesting, even in something that kind of feels like a bottle episode, like Eraserhead. A lot of it takes place in this one room. And this illusion of, you know, the grotesquely material and the tender, I think is shown, for example, where they bring the baby thing home and they're trying to sleep and Mary just can't deal with the sort of incessant crying.
Yeah. Watching that again now, having become a parent,
yeah,
I experienced that part of the film so differently from when I first watched it as a teenager.
Right. Yeah, and then Mary leaving, and then Henry's response being, you know, he steams he has like a steam humidifier going and so on. So, and he's troubled, it seems, by the tenderness that he feels to something that appears to him to be quite monstrous. And the weird ontology of the baby as well. And then obviously the woman across the hall as well.
Yes.
Who's such an interesting prototype of a maybe Dorothy Valens, maybe even a Rita, although slightly different. Perdita in Wild at Heart. There's these interesting...
So these are kind of film noir femme fatales,
true,
but they are always with a twist, aren't they?
This is true.
Lynch never quite does the conventional thing.
Yeah.
There's always something else going on
Well
with those
said.
characters.
Yeah, and they're often mothers, actually.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Marietta, Lula's mother in Wild at Heart. I think Perdita is, Joanna is. There's very interesting, because I think a lot of things that come up with regards to the material of critique of Lynch and his style is his portrayal of women. And again, maybe an ambiguity for some people as to what side of a line of a particular type of gaze he treads. But there's also, I think, an equal, endorsement of some of the representation in the areas and the manner in which he represents women's experiences.
Absolutely.
Mulholland Drive is a good example, I think.
Yeah,
of
I think that's
tension.
a great example. And I think it's also worth mentioning that off camera, so many actresses have said how privileged they felt to work with him and how kind of empowering he was for them. So in this day and age, I think that's a really important thing to recognise.
I really do. I don't think that's... It's one of these other things, you know, beyond the sort of weird brand that's, I think, important to discuss and consider. And I mean, going back to Eraserhead, it's maybe a blunt instrument, but do you have a favorite scene, or if you were to limit it to 3, perhaps?
Oh, for Eraserhead, it's just the lady behind the radiator. I just love the lady behind the radiator. I love the way that she is that sort of transcendent, beautiful, joyous character, but yet because of the strange prosthetics on her face, she's also never quite that as well.
Exactly.
There's something unsettling and uneasy about her, so you're not allowed to kind of dwell with that joy. You're constantly forced to question it and be curious about it.
That's so well put. That's so well put.
For me, that's what I particularly love about Eraserhead. How about you?
I think because I rewatched it in preparation for tonight, but I think that's only the second time that I've seen it, and I think my rewatch of Mulholland Drive was the 5th.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's interesting, considering I wonder how many of our students who do have this interest in Lynch, not only as a direct result of his passing on, but this kind of Twin Peaks appreciation. I wonder how many have gone back and watched, watch Dune, watch Straight Story, because he's done so many different things. But I think...
And that's right, because when we talk about the Lynchian, we kind of expect that, you know, the red room and the donuts or whatever. But there's actually so many of his films are really different in style. The Straight Story is a completely different kind of film.
It really is.
And I rewatched that recently, and I was kind of surprised. It wasn't quite how I remembered it.
Yeah, I'm definitely do a rewatch on that, because even in that sort of like onrush of activity toward Lynch, Straight Story, I think I was just...
it tends to get left out of discussion because people don't know what to do with it. It's
that's
actually
true.
a really interesting film.
Yeah.
And that sense of joy is exposed, you know, absolutely.
Yeah, so fully.
We have less of the darkness.
That's right. I mean, I think if I was to pick... So there's so many things about Eraserhead that I like and that you can kind of see as foreshadowings, you know, in the radiator sequence or sequences, the sort of appearances of the strange tree-like nerve, you know, the arm, even the patterning on the floor. You start to get some recursive sort of aesthetic or iconographical features of his style. But with Lynch, it's so interesting in his entire oeuvre, it's kind of like a refraction of a repetition of a copy. It's never quite the same thing, but it's kind of trying to intone something similar in the curtains, in the arm, in the chevrons, on the floor, some of the dialogue as well. Machines, electricity, lamps flickering, and so on and so forth.
That's a motif that goes right the way through his oeuvre.
Or even, in The Return, I think there's just like a whole episode with the sooty-faced miners just in this sort of electrical storm. But I really like the dinner scene, actually. I really like it.
Do you know, I think that's the creepiest scene in the
so,
film. So everybody talks about the baby,
but
the baby is not as creepy
I
as the
completely
weird
agree.
little chicken things.
Yeah, the
What are
strange,
those chickens?
the strange like bloody quails. It's and also the way in which I think the father's name's Bill. There's a particular shot of Henry looking towards Bill, who's just got this frozen, almost Joker-like grin on his face. And Mary appearing from the kitchen behind him. And it's almost like a sort of classic Venetian, like smiley face, frowny face illusion, but so strange and surrealized. And the way in which Mary's mother behaves towards Henry is very interesting. It kind of recalls Marietta to Sailor in Wild at Heart. She kind of like sniffs him or kind of like licks his neck. And it's another one of these, I think it might be even, aside from all the sort of erotics that take place with the lady across the hall, there's certain strange motifs of eroticism. Lynch has, aside from just sort of a strange aesthetic, there's these thematics that are quite unique to him. I mean, Blue Velvet, for example, is deeply steeped in a lot of erotic discourse. I mean, what do you make of that in Mulholland Drive and in Eraserhead?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a strong Oedipal streak in many of Lynch's films, aren't there? What you make of that is up to you. I guess I'm kind of more interested with Eraserhead. I'm more interested in the theme of abjection. So I guess for people that might not have come across this term before, this is a term that was devised by Julia Kristeva. I know you know this very well, to kind of talk about our feelings of disgust towards things that give us the ick in contemporary parlance. And it's about kind of trying to reject what what challenges our ideas of a clean and proper self.
Well said.
So I find that that kind of response to the disgusting or grotesque elements of the body are perhaps more interesting or more dominant to me in that film than anything erotic. I agree,
I think the most obvious sort of lines or expression of that is just kind of the love scene between Henry and the lady across the hall. And even that sort of descends into something far more ineffably beyond a sort of a basic sort of a basic heteronormative eroticism. I mean, there's all these surreal images, like just the sharp chiaroscuro, the weird egg floating around in the darkness. I like the phrase that you used earlier to say, you're not like off the hook. And I think whenever Lynch does present something to you that you can have a very reductive reading of, it's never quite right in a very important and complex way, including eroticism. And I think you're right. I think Eraserhead is really exploring the abject and redemption. I mean, Lynch has said famously and mysteriously that he considers it to be his most spiritual film. And the end sequence in the white light, there's something apotheotic about some of Henry's journey. Something quite biblical in a sense, an Isaac Abraham type of situation you could suggest. He said he did in preparation for it, aside from reading Kafka. He said he read a verse from the Bible, but he can't remember which one. So it's I think a lot of people tend to focus on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's always when you're kind of thinking about transcendence and spirituality with Lynch, it's always worth remembering his own transcendental meditational practices,
Exactly.
which have absolutely informed so much of his work, I think.
Absolutely.
And that tends to be forgotten about because people aren't familiar with that or don't really know how to handle it. But I think it's underlying everything and very closely connected to that sense of underlying joy and spirituality in the universe that we find in his films.
And humor, even if it might be dark. I mean,
his films are so funny.
They're so funny.
They're so funny.
I mean, Twin Peaks is also just saturated with such humor.
God.
Obvious humor, but it's always just...
it's still funny, even when you've watched it several times. It doesn't, it doesn't fade, the humor of it.
So, and I think it's maybe to consider maybe Mulholland Drive a little here.
Yeah, we should talk about Mulholland Drive.
Because we've talked about, Lynch in such a... Like, the Lynchian in and of itself might be... it has this kind of idiosyncratic gravity in the same way that a word like jouissance does. It's kind of untranslatable. It's like a prime number. It refers to itself, the Lynchian and Lynch in that mode. And so much of that mode, as we've discussed, is in so many different remits. And maybe before I ask you about Mulholland Drive and dimensions in that film, like whose perspective you're in, reversals, doubles, and so on. Did you, because Lynch seems to be so interested in sound, did you ever listen to any of his music?
Yes, I was a huge fan of Julie Cruz and Angelo Badalamenti at the time when Twin Peaks came out, obviously. So, I guess that's my entry point into Lynch's music. I still adore those tracks. I could listen to them all day. And Industrial Symphony No. 1, which is a kind of a prolonged music video for Julie Cruz, I guess. Which is fantastic. More recently, I watched his film of the Duran Duran concert. Oh, wow. Which is like Lynch doing something completely different again. It's quite a straight concert film in some ways. And you think, Duran Duran, wow. Yeah. How did he get from there to there?
Yeah, and also all the commercials he directed. So many.
Yes. I love that he keeps surprising you in that way. But I know music is really important to you, and that's a really foundational part of your admiration for Lynch. So
it is.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
I mean, I think it was after watching Mulholland Drive. I became aware through a couple of friends and so on who were like, Lynch is a musician, and I thought the concept to be quite strange. It was like, I couldn't really picture him, sitting with a guitar or, singing. And even when you do hear his sort of shrill, ghost-like intonation and voicing, it's very, but it works so well despite being seemingly so at odds with the music upon and alongside which it floats. But I listened to The Big Dream and Crazy Clown Time, and Crazy Clown Time is one of my favorite albums ever. It's got this strange American Gothic quality to him. It kind of intones it. It's part sort of like, 1800s Americana. There's a bit of Poe, there's a bit of Whitman, there's a bit of Auden, a bit of Chandler. He's interested in crime, and it's got this kind of rockabilly quality, but it's also so sedate and surreal. And then his more ambient work in things like The Air's on Fire, which is actually quite nice to sleep to. Strange dreams, perhaps, but it's he had so much. He had so many different ways of expressing himself.
In the same way that his work is so visually distinctive, and you immediately know when you're watching a David Lynch film, you immediately know when you're hearing a David Lynch soundtrack as well, don't you? And I think you can see the influence of that in popular culture. If you look at the career of someone like Lana Del Rey, it wouldn't be quite what it is without the influence of David Lynch, I don't think. Yeah,
there's a sort of sandy... There's something so influential in that type of, specifically vocal, like young singers, I think. And obviously Krista Bell as Tammy Preston in The Return, but this kind of, she seems to be an interesting music and sort of TV member of this like Lynch woman, from Dorothy, Rita, Diane, or sort of, it's almost as if he has a sort of muse-like type in a strange way. But his music is really unique, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of Mulholland Drive, what do you make of I mentioned earlier, sort of dimensions, because it's a strange film.
I have my own theory about that. Do you think we can share these? Because we don't want to give spoilers to people who might be watching who haven't seen the film before.
But I'll be mindful of that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I read the film, I don't think this will spoil it, as a kind of a Mobius strip. So I don't think it spoils to say that there's two versions of the story. Yeah. One after the other. Yeah. And people have different theories about how those two relate to each other. But my theory is that there isn't one that comes first or one that comes after, or one that is real and one that is not real. I think they're both real. Both dimensions are real, and they're kind of interconnected in this way that you can never quite add up.
I absolutely love that. Because
there are clues to that. There's evidence for that in the viewing. Because if you try and read it in the way of some of the more popular readings of the film, it doesn't quite work because there are things that don't add up. That kind of occur around the intersection of the two narratives.
So the fold.
I think that they're always going round and round, and you can never completely make them meet, and in that Mobius strip kind of way.
I love that. I think that's fantastic. It's so interesting you mentioned the word clues, and this kind of goes back to my comment about Lynch being interested in crime. He's always dealing with gangsters.
Particularly in Mulholland Drive. It's a noir film, right?
Just like Lost Highway, there's a lot of similarities between the two structurally and maybe in something of the tone. Although Rita and Betty aren't really sort of figured as femme fatales. I mean, after Rita loses her, let me.
Well, they kind of are femme fatales, but again, it's femme fatales with a twist. He never.
Exactly.
He never just endorses that. He always,
exactly
tweaks it somehow.
Exactly. I think I've been recently thinking a lot about time travel. My upcoming monograph with Bloomsbury this year is concerned about time travel in 21st century science fiction cinema, looking at things like Chris Marker's Le Jeté, looking at 12 Monkeys by Terry Gilliam, and Primer by Shane Kurth, and a lot. So I'd never really considered Mulholland Drive as a potential time travel film.
But it's a time travel, but you can't go back or forward in
time.
That's right. You just keep going round and round.
It's kind of like a loop, something like
exactly. It's a loop.
Like Time Crimes, which has a sort of just like loop. It might be elliptical, but you always kind of, I forget who said this, but you're always kind of behind the narrative pace in Mulholland Drive. You're sort of piecing it together along with our principles. But I like, and I think maybe if the sort of fold of the Mobius strip might be Winkies, but I think it might be a turnstile, to use Christopher Nolan's language.
So my favourite scene in Mulholland Drive is the scene in Winkies.
The first Winkies scene.
The first Winkies scene, which I find utterly terrifying every time I watch it, and I've watched it many times, and it never fails to terrify. And it's just some guys walking behind a diner. I won't say any more, but it's so mundane. It's like about as mundane. They're basically walking to where the bins are.
In essence.
And it is the most chilling thing ever committed to the cinema screen, I think.
I completely agree, and it's one of the things that scene is so great because it really does so many good representations of what it is that makes Lynch so unique. Because as you point out, on the page, in terms of just dramatic action, it might be very banal, very basic. But the investment of immersion and depth from the performers, Badalamenti's music, and just the way in which Lynch mounts and tracks a shot, the speed at which things move, it's terrifying.
He often uses these kind of shots where the camera is very unstable. It's moving around, it's very active.
That's true.
And again, it gives that sense of inherent unease or discomfort that you might not notice unless you're watching closely. But that sense of not being quite able to place where the cinematographer's gaze is coming from.
That's so well put.
The frame is always slightly ajar.
Well said.
And it really gives me that sense of the uncanny, I think. He does it a lot in Twin Peaks as well.
He does.
Particularly when the infamous Bob appears.
Exactly.
He's the incarnation of all evil. But in the scenes where Bob appears, you'll find that the camera is rarely still.
That's true.
It's moving, but it's not moving in any regular way. It's moving it's kind of floating.
Right.
And there's even a sense in which, in those scenes in particular, it might be replicating Bob's own point of view. So it's kind of a point of view shot there, but that's not happening in the Winkies diner scene because there's no one whose point of view it should be.
That's true. That's true.
That is so unsettling.
That's true. It's almost a John Carpenter, The Thing technique, in which you put all of this tension. Tarantino talks about this very well to his credit. You know, in a bottle episode like that, where suspicion and discord and unease is just kind of like, without a referent to anchor it, it just kind of bounces around and can only go one way, and that's into the viewer.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to potentially be drawn into occupying the point of view of absolute evil. It's a very strange thing. And that's, I think, why I asked you about dimensions, because there's so many things that I don't want to talk about certain objects. But I think
the blue box. So you can
and the key, on the keys, plural. But I think what it really redounds to is, you know, this. What I noticed when I was watching Mulholland Drive this time was how many POV shots there actually are.
Right.
There's many corridor shots. There's obviously in Twin Peaks the long corridor shots. Yeah. But in Mulholland Drive there's a lot. Yeah. Much in the same way his transitions in Eraserhead are like pretty jarring. They induce a kind of vertigo, a kind of syncope at the same time. You know, Henry just appears out of sort of like a weird dark shadow. Is that a cracked shell? Is that a hole in the wall? He also does it a little bit in Dune with all the sort of weird spice melange trips. These like interlinkings of dimensions.
I haven't seen Dune for maybe 30 years.
Sure.
I am so eager to go back and rewatch it. That's on my agenda for
the
coming weekend, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I want to. Could I ask you about Club Silencio without it being a spoiler?
Wow, I think you can. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe to be indirect about it, what do you think? If Babylon is to Chazelle what Mulholland Drive is to Lynch, what is Lynch saying about Hollywood and cinema in Mulholland Drive, in your opinion?
Lynch is fascinated with the illusions of Hollywood, isn't he? But he addresses it much less directly than in a film like Babylon, as you mentioned, or like in Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, or any of those kind of things. But there is something in that scene in Club Silencio where he is engaging with the nature of cinema itself, isn't he? And really meditating very deeply on it, I think. Yeah,
lingering on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's my other favourite scene, but that must be everybody's favourite scene, right?
Yeah,
and I tell you what, when I was rewatching it recently, just last weekend, the thing that struck me, of course, is how much of a drag performance it is.
Oh, yeah.
So, of course, why didn't it occur to me that Bianca Del Rio must have got her name from Rebecca Del Rio, and from that lip sync performance in Mulholland Drive? Probably everybody knows that except me. But I just realised it rewatching it. And that seemed to me to be another new way into that film, which I hadn't perhaps anticipated the first few times I saw it.
I mean, there might be some interesting and profitable ways of thinking of Duchovny, maybe some elisions in that respect. And in The Return, I mean, The Return has some... The Return goes in some really interesting... I mean, the whole Vegas part of it is pretty much the newest addition in terms of a different community to the mise-en-scène, or the sort of diegetic world of Twin Peaks. And I think Lynch was still very interested in like creating new characters, new again copies of refractions of reproductions in different ways and coming at them from different perspectives, which I think is pretty much what Mulholland Drive really centralizes as well. Yeah. Rita and Betty, and perspectives that they share, that they exchange. Without saying
so let me ask you about Club Silencio.
Yeah,
because, you know, with your particular interest in music, there is no band. So tell me, what do you make of that?
Wow. I mean, so it's interesting that we should be having this discussion about this particular film at this time when I'm teaching English 336, which is seeing and hearing sound, so literature and music and literature and sound. And I mean, we started off this half module thinking quite abstract and then reifying things as we went along. And we opened by discussing Tolkien's The Silmarillion, and this idea of a cosmogony being musical or intoned in some way in sound. And I think Lynch is interested in genealogies and origins. I mean, Eraserhead begins with this kind of weird birth scene in a strange way. same in Dune, same in these kind of dream sequences where, in The Return, for example, the birth of, I mean, the whole, I think it's the 8th episode with the Trinity test. It's...
They're birth scenes, but they're also objection scenes,
absolutely, absolutely.
So,
it's
as
not
indeed
quite,
many birth scenes are. That's not an original thing to say by any means, but nevertheless, he finds that in those scenes.
I think he does. I think he does in a lot of things that a lot of people might try to read reductively and be let off the hook. Parenting, curiosity, prurience, desire, violence. It just keeps you in place and really puts you in contact with it in a very direct way. And I think it's very moving as a result. But anyway, I mean, in terms of, I think the sound is this idea of there is no band, and Lynch having this kind of weird soundscape that's so associated with like even silence in this film. I mean, Eraserhead is so loud, despite the fact that it's ostensibly supposed to be quite silent. I think he's so interested in producing sound, and sound being a surface on and through which some of this Lynchian quality inheres. And when, you know, music is kind of separated schizophonically from its source in Club Silencio, it's almost as if to suggest that, you know, this kind of shared dream, this unconscious, these kind of transcendental depths don't necessarily need a dreamer to intone them. They can be, it is a plane of immanence, to use Deleuzian language, or a force that's kind of independent of any individual expression thereof. And I think it you know, even the dream of Hollywood itself, to be like, you know, there is no real Hollywood. I mean, I think of, there's a character called the Tish McGev in Angel, which is my favorite TV show of all time, who says to Angel from Buffy, you belong in Los Angeles because nobody belongs in Los Angeles. And there's something about that, you know, again, the sort of the big dream of Hollywood.
You know, that's so interesting. I would never have thought of Angel and Mulholland Drive as being close partners, but of course
they
are.
Really
they're
are.
from almost the same, exactly the same historical moment, and they're both set in LA, and they both sort of deal with that
noirish,
strange noir fever dream of Los Angeles.
Supernatural as well. What do you make of the scene? I forget what her name is now. I don't think it's really a spoiler. When Betty and Rita are in Aunt Ruth's house, and there's a knock on the door, and I forget the neighbor's name. What do you make of that scene? It's just one of many, which is just such a strange vignette.
Yeah, and it's one of the characters that doesn't repeat in the other half of the film.
Well noted.
So that's quite interesting, I think. I don't know what I make of that.
Me neither.
I'm sure people have lots of complicated theories about why that is. I don't know. Again, it's deeply unsettling,
it's
isn't it?
So
she
spooky.
seems to have some kind of vision or
insight like the fireman in a way.
The doubling of the narrative and the different dimensions, if that's what we're going to call them.
And that something is askew or askance in some way, that there is danger, not to again spoil things. But I think, what do you make of Lynch's interest in, I don't think it's really as discussed, but his interest in crime? I don't really find many people discussing that.
I think it is because I've mentioned film noir already, and I think he's deeply influenced by film noir. And a lot of his interest in crime is coming quite directly from that. From that tradition, that very classic Hollywood tradition. So I guess that's how I would interpret it within that particular framework. But as I've said before, I think that he always tweaks it. He's not just taking it as a given. He's always complicating it, asking questions about it, being curious about how all the parts fit together. I think you're absolutely right. Do you have any insight into that?
No, not really. I mean, I just kind of, it's something I think in watching Lost Highway, Blue Velvet, with a character like Frank being in so many ways, or Bob for that matter, to be ostensibly abject in the sense of criminality, fine, but it's so much more than that, or so much more complicated and maybe pseudo-spiritual or mythopoetic than that. I mean, these are sort of primeval forces that, you know, Lynch is sort of like tapping into and presenting, which a lot of people might think is naive, but, you know, in terms of a sincere and unironic approach to good and evil, to really try and present evil. And the way in which he goes about it is deeply unsettling. that it's strangely believable. But I think crime is a frame in and through which, you know, he deals with power and mischance. There's so much, you know, black humor and strange things that result from crime. For example, in Mulholland Drive, I don't know whether this is a spoiler. It's the scene with yeah, okay. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, but there's.
So tell me about your favourite scene in Mulholland Drive.
Sure, I think it's either the Winky scene or the audition.
Oh, the audition is a fabulous scene. That's such a good scene.
I think it's one of those two.
Yes.
Oh, how about you?
The Winky scene for me. But tell me about the audition scene, because we haven't talked about that yet.
Speaking of these, I think it's again just another example of how it is that Lynch can show you the illusion, and he's almost like a stage magician, so much more than that, but who kind of shows you the mechanism for the trick, performs the trick, and you're still amazed.
Yeah.
And there's something about that quality in the dialogue. Everybody's so straight, like the director, for example, the way that he speaks, he's like, don't get real until it gets real. These kind of weird, almost catchphrases that Lynch, sound bites, if you will, but they're just, you know, strange. And the way that, you know, they're like, oh, she's a revelation, yeah, big time. The kind of way that the people talk, but the performances surrounding that dialogue and the way that it's shot makes them cohere in such a weird, uncanny way. And I think that tension is so perfectly realized in Betty's audition, because on the one hand, the very cheesy machismo older male actor is almost like a strange caricature in the way that a not small portion of his characters can feel like, but again, it's just slightly off kilter, that it's not as simple or easy to reduce.
I remember when I first saw that scene, I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to read it as being good or not.
Oh, really? Okay.
I was like, is this meant to be Betty performing really well?
Sure.
Or is this meant to be really bad?
Sure.
I genuinely didn't know.
Has that changed over time?
I think it's supposed to be her doing it well, isn't it?
Because, I think so too.
Because the previous version is not
where
good,
she rehearses
when she's doing it with Rita.
Yeah.
But that uncertainty that I had that is to do with the kind of frame that's placed around it, and I think that's an important part of it, actually.
Sure. And it's such an interesting, I think it's such an interesting moment for the characterization of Betty, because it's a moment in which this ostensible, so you've had about an hour in the film's runtime of Betty being almost a caricature of a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, naive, hopeful, expectant, the sort of quintessential sort of starlet story of Hollywood. And this idea that it encounters the reality of the machinery, these kind of cloaked figures in strange rooms, you know, with goons, and you know, this kind of this kind of monstrosity of power in its criminal elements, but also in its monetary elements, despite the fact that the lawyers for the company are so strange with the espresso scene where he spits the espresso out in his napkin. They're sort of weird, but they're so menacing at the same time.
And so funny.
And so funny, yeah, almost a caricature of that menace, but that menace in and of itself in its caricature is still menacing. I think it shows that Betty can reach into these depths that are well beyond what it is that she ostensibly appears to be, specifically in the preceding hour, that she's sort of in control of that scene.
There's always this playing off of surfaces and depths.
Yeah.
It's the illusion around the curtain.
Yeah.
Is there something behind the curtain, or is there just the curtain?
Yeah.
Is there a band? There is no band.
Yeah.
And I feel that the audition kind of plays into that as well.
Yeah.
That maybe we're kind of looking in vain for some depths behind Betty, because she is just this arrangement of surfaces at any given time. And as we know, that radically changes at one point in the film.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that maybe the sort of disruption of that barrier takes place when the director, you know, calls action. That in the instantiation of pretense, you arrive at some kind of truth, or maybe confronted with the desire for that truth that may or not be there, might be prohibited. But it's interesting that it takes place in that space for the first time, really, that you see. Because up till that point, she's like, oh, you know, let's try and do this, and this, just like the movies. And then when it's just like the movies, it's real. It's that interesting tension.
Absolutely. I mean, you asked me earlier what I thought about Lynch's representation of Hollywood.
Yeah.
And I think that Mulholland Drive is in many ways a love letter to Hollywood.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's not just beautiful in a depiction of Los Angeles, but
Yeah.
also just in the way that it uses a cinematic language.
Well said.
That its arrangement of space
Yeah.
and colour and light and on screen and just the
Yeah.
music and everything about it is so perfectly realised. And I think quite a lot has been said recently about how Mulholland Drive may be his greatest film. I'm interested to know if you agree with that. Also, it topped one poll as being the greatest film of the 21st century so far.
Sure.
And I think this is partly why, because that cinematic language operates independently of the need for a coherent narrative. So in some ways, the narrative isn't coherent, deliberately so. We can't ever get to the end of that Mobius strip and say exactly what is happening to Betty and Rita or Camilla.
Or where we arrive.
But we can say that it's sumptuous, it's gorgeous, and it knows how to tell a different kind of story that's more on the level of affect, of feeling, of our emotional responses to what we see.
Which I've been referring to as sort of the Yiddish quality. This kind of strange ability to intone the ineffable. I think you're absolutely right, as it be that holding that sort of not even mystique, but I think also truth, strangely enough, and that tension is also true of Lynch, that it's mysterious but also very, very true. And I think maybe that might bring me to ask you. I'm kind of cheating here because you asked me, but I'll ask you first. Do you think Mulholland Drive is his best film? I'll ask you in two parts. Do you think it's his best film in his oeuvre? And which is your favorite film of his corpus?
Okay, so my favorite film is probably not a popular choice.
Okay.
So my favorite film is Wild at Heart. And it's probably because it's the first one that I saw other than the Twin Peaks series. And because it was out at around the same time. He made it in between the two series of Twin Peaks.
That's right, 92, I think.
Again, it just spoke to me at that particular age. And also, I love road movies, and it's a road movie, and it just does that with just such perfection.
It does.
But it's also one of his more mainstream films. And mainstream for Lynch is still not that mainstream.
Absolutely.
But it does tell a sort of coherent linear narrative. So it's quite unusual in that respect. But I just have a deep fondness for it. In a way that sort of transcends any kind of critical judgment. But I think his greatest film is Mulholland Drive because of that sort of deep understanding of cinematic language in it.
I think it's interesting that you said that, it's this kind of ostensible, like almost novelesque narrative coherence in terms of the logic, linearity of information. Being suspended in favor of a sort of an affective milieu. I think this it also is really...
I love that phrase, affective milieu.
I think it's really brought out in something like Dune. And I think what I suspect is that De Laurentiis showed Lynch Dune, and Lynch, maybe before or as a direct result of that meeting, read it and was like, Herbert is doing something very unique but very impressionistic. It's so strange, that world, because it's so detailed but so vague. And thought this is a perfect vehicle for that affective quality. I think it was Stanley Kubrick who said, a film should, in terms of any other art that it should be emulating, it should be music in the sense of an arrangement of affects, an arrangement of feelings, as opposed to the logical promulgation of information as it would be in a novel. And I think it frees him up to kind of do something as Mobius-like and multi-dimensional and rhizomatic as Mulholland Drive, at the ostensible cost of narrative linearity. But I think he gains so much.
So do you agree it's his greatest film?
I think so too. I would say that. I think my favorite is Blue Velvet. I think because of when I watched it.
It's often about that, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's something about the curiosity of Jeffrey Beaumont that the way in which it's portrayed is, strangely jejune, but also so prurient. It's pulling so hard in both directions, but somehow still staying coherent or together in terms of how it feels. I absolutely loved it. And, talk about just juxtapositions all over that particular film. I
think we're coming to an end,
I think so too.
Yeah, this has been a fabulous conversation. We need to do this again sometime.
I would absolutely love that. Maybe, and this is me, it'd be great if we could each give each other one film and then discuss it. I'd probably give you something from Cronenberg.
Okay.
Do you like Cronenberg?
I've not seen a huge number of his films. I've seen a few, but I don't know his work in the way that I know Lynch's work.
Cool. Well, I mean, maybe we can talk about more Lynch down the line.
Yeah.
Maybe
we can talk about Tim Burton.
Burton might be great. Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Or Raimi, for that matter.
Okay.
Yeah. I've been meaning to watch Evil Dead.
So this could be a repeating date.
Yeah. I'd love to do that. Yeah. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for joining us, and thanks for having us to the Duke Cinema.